like at that time? Was it bustling? Was it?
It was a bustling, gritty, wonderfully exciting place. I can't tell you what a shock it was, what a culture shock it was for us, coming from Little Britain, this little suburbia that I had lived in, the smallness of the buildings, to come to this metropolis, which was New York. It was 42nd Street. You know, I mean, I never forget riding in a cab with a plexiglass roof. It was a glass roof. I don't think they'd invented plexiglass at that time. I remember lying back and going down the streets next to Rockefeller Center, which of course had just been built. It was the flagship of the New York buildings, plus the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building. They were all there. It was the most thrilling because it was exactly the way you hoped it would be, but in life things so very seldom are. But New York City, to a young English kid, it was astonishingly exciting.
Did you live in Manhattan?
I must tell you that we started off our life in America at the Algonquin Hotel, because we were met by my mother's first husband, who happened to be a very successful writer, wrote a very successful play called, it's going right out of my head, but his name is Reginald Denham, and it's called Ladies in Retirement.
Oh, yes.
Remember that very successful play? Well, that was my mother's first husband. Anyway, he met...
It was a fine movie with Ida Lupino, was it?
That's right. And Flora Robson, I think, was it, or maybe Flora was in the play, I'm not sure. Anyway, he met us with his then wife, and they took us on a tour of Manhattan, never to be forgotten, and put us into the Algonquin Hotel until we met our sponsor, who then whisked us away, believe it or not, in a Packard limousine to this magnificent lake called Lake Mahopac, which was in Putnam County. And they had a summer home there. They lived on Park Avenue, but they sent us out, actually, in their car, and driven by a German chauffeur, which took us back a little bit. We thought, because America wasn't at war, and he was this fella who was driving us, and he was the enemy. It was rather daunting. Anyway, we went up to Lake Mahopac. They had a summer house there. They put us in the next door house. They bought the house next door to them as protection, and it was empty, and they put us in there. So we started out our life in America, living in this small frame house on Lake Mahopac, which was pretty gorgeous.
It is, but it's more than 45 minutes from Broadway.
Yes, indeed.
So how did you make out? How did you adjust?
Well, this first summer we arrived in August, right? It was terribly hot. We were totally unused to the heat and the stickiness of and the humidity of New York. New York City, not much air conditioning in those days. It was quite something. We weren't quite ready for that. And the mosquitoes and the lake and summer there. The great thing was the ice cream was so darn good. I'll never forget that. But of course, here we were thrown down into the absolute nth degree of Americana. We were living in a small town on a lake, surrounded with real American people, not movie American people, not Joan Blondell and all that crowd that I've been watching all my young life, but the real thing. And we made so many wonderful friends, people who lived on the lake who came by and visited and brought pies, and it was a wonderful experience for us, and we totally appreciated it and keep in touch to this day with some of them.
You must have been thinking about your future at this point.
No, I wasn't. I was just enjoying the now, to be perfectly honest with you. But I mean, obviously, I had to think about my future, because we had to think about how we were going to get on our feet and get started. And my mother certainly was not about to let the grass grow under her feet. What we had to do first and foremost was we had to get what they called a quota number. We had to get, in today's parlance, a green card. And they weren't green cards in those days. I don't know what the heck they were, but it was called a quota number.
Which would have allowed you to work?
It would have allowed us to work, and yes, we would have been permanent residents, immigrants, in other words. And it took in those days, well, it still takes, I know, from the many friends I have who are now embarked on trying to become or get green cards. It takes a long time. But it took us about probably 1.5 to 2 years. And everything had to be filled out in quadruplicate. More, in fact. And I had to do all the filling out because I had the best handwriting. And my mother and I did nothing but fill out forms for 4 people. So we sent them off to Washington. My mother wrote a letter to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt because she knew that Mrs. Roosevelt had toured the United States in 1938 with my grandfather, George Lansbury, in the interests of promoting peace. And so to this day, I don't know whether Mrs. Roosevelt had anything to do with it, because I think my mother got a letter from her office, but nothing promising anything. But we did finally get our quota numbers, our green cards, and we were able to start to work.
Start work doing what?
Indeed, what? We couldn't get arrested, you know. I mean, and we were very, very pushed in those days. My mother got a job, oddly enough. Well, not oddly, because she was such a good actress. She got a job, but it was not in the U.S. It was to go through Canada with a tour of Tonight at 8:30 by Noel Coward. And a woman called Pixie Hardwick, Lady Hardwick, who was Cedric Hardwick's wife, and Herbert Wilcox was the producer. He was a movie producer in England in those days. And his wife, Anna Neagle, who was a very famous actress in England, and had played Victoria Regina. And anyway, those 3 people mounted this tour to raise money for the Canadian RAF. They were going to raise the money to educate young British Spitfire pilots that were brought over from England to Canada to be trained to go back and fight in the Battle of Britain.
And we should explain, even though it sounds silly to do so, that RAF stands for Royal Air Force.
Royal Air Force.
Yes.
And this was the Royal Canadian Air Force,
Right.
RCAF. So it wasn't, she couldn't get a job in America, but because of her contacts through Pixie Hardwick, Lady Hardwick, and Sir Herbert Wilcox, she was able to get that job, and she was one of that group. Brenda Forbes, a very lovely American actress, was in that tour, and several other people. And so off they went. I, meantime, had been in drama school. I managed in 1940, in the fall of 1940, to get another scholarship. This time at the Fagan School of Dramatic Art, which was in the International Building of Rockefeller Center. Now, can you imagine a more glamorous place to go to drama school? I used to look out of the window, and there we'd watch the skaters down below, you know. And I'll never forget that first Christmas of 1940. It was something else, because America still was not at war, but the tree was up and everything was beautiful. It was like a dreamland, you know. All you needed was Sonia Henney.
But at that time, the Battle of Britain was taking place. wasn't it?
Exactly.
Did you feel guilty about being in safe America? Well,
Of course. We spend our lives, we used to make up, we were only allowed to send something the size of a shoebox. So we would fill these shoe boxes with the most incredible collection of goodies, food, not nylons, but just silk stockings, and pieces of food that would travel, fruit cake, tea, which they were very short on, tinned butter, tinned bacon, things like that. We'd make up these care packages, and they really were care packages, and send them to Isolde, my sister, send them to my grandmother. Actually, my grandmother moved up to the north of Ireland, and of course they managed to do very well up there because they had plenty of butter and eggs. They never wanted for anything of that sort in Ireland during the war. But in England they did, and so our relatives, my aunts, uncles, and people of that sort all received packages from us.
you must have hung on the war news every night.
Oh, we did. Oh, we absolutely did. And we also joined the Red Cross. I used to go and wrap bandages. My mother went and gave recitations and gave readings to raise money for the war effort. Bundles for Britain, we were involved in collecting clothes, sending clothes to Britain for people who couldn't They weren't making or manufacturing clothes for people, only the army at that
Did
time.
you find Americans by and large sympathetic to your plight and to the cause of Great Britain?
Enormously so. They were so warm that you just can't beat the Americans for that. They simply bent over backwards. I think in their heart of hearts they had a sense of that they should be there. They should be in it, some of them. Many of them didn't want to be, didn't want to know, very isolationist, particularly the Republicans. But as a Democrat, I can say that. However, in the main, they were extraordinarily warm-hearted and open-handed as far as we were concerned. And they gave us every opportunity, and Bundles for Britain did land office business. Thank goodness.
Did you have talented classmates at drama school?
Not particularly, I wouldn't have said. Interestingly enough, the students that I went to drama school with were mostly young society girls who really never really were going to go into the theater, you know what I mean. They went in it to meet people, to come to New York. They came from every state mostly from the southern states. I won't say every state, mostly from the southern states. And some of them had very strong southern accents, which was interesting to me because I heard a lot of regional accents that I didn't realize existed, you know. So.
You went to drama school in England, you went to drama school in America.
Mm.
How did they compare? Was one superior to the other, do you think? Or could you make a comparison?
Well, I think that in England you go to drama school to go into the theater. Mainly, only the theater. That's what your eye is on, going into repertory, maybe getting a chance to come into London in a role, but it's a serious business, the theater. Whereas in New York, you have one eye on the theater, another on radio, and hopefully maybe down the road in movies, you know. So it's a much broader range of options for you as a student. You've got more things that you might go into, more chances that you might have. But so in that respect, it was much more glamorous in New York than it was in London. London was tough stuff, you know, tough training.
Had television made any impression at that point?
No.
Had you had television in England at all?
Well, obviously we had, but it was very, very early days. Television was a kind of a magic word that people talked about, but nobody ever thought that it would happen big. And certainly the war interrupted it, I think.
Oh, sure.
Although I do believe that in the 40s, in this country, a friend of mine, Jane Greer, the actress, told me the other day that she was in a production, a television production, I think it was 1944, and she was saying that the makeup was extraordinary because they had to wear very yellow makeup and very brown lipstick. You looked absolutely like a gargoyle, but the lights were such for the television camera and these huge boxes and everything, that the whole process was kind of daunting.
What about Broadway? Did you go visit some of the shows on Broadway?
I did, thanks to a wonderful woman who became a mentor to me. Through Bundles for Britain, I met this wonderful lady, Mrs. George Perkins, and she decided she would let me live with her and her family in New York City while I was at drama school during the week, and that I'd go home to Lake Mahopac on the weekend. So I lived with them in their house on East 94th Street, and she took me to the theater and enabled me to see some of the great actresses of that period on stage, which I could never have afforded to go and see. I didn't have any money at all. If I had a nickel, I took the Madison Avenue bus. If I had a dime, I took the Fifth Avenue bus because that was the fare. And if I really wanted to save money and save the nickel for a cup of coffee at lunch with my sandwich, which I had in my little bag, I walked from East 94th Street down to 50th.
So who are some of these great ladies? Catherine Cornell?
Catherine Cornell, Helen Hayes,
Lynn
Grace
Fontaine?
George, Lynn Fontaine. Some of the great, also went to some wonderful concerts, saw some great conductors, Toscanini, went to Carnegie Hall, and all with Mrs. Perkins. It was incredible. I'd climb into this chauffeur-driven limo with her, and off we'd go. And she was a sweet, wonderful woman of German background. She was one of the Merck family.
So by this time, were you thoroughly imbued with the theater and with getting involved in it in some way?
Yes, you ask me that as if, was I ambitious? Was I ambitious? I was still kind of dazzled with what was going on, and you have to remember that I was still very young. I was only 15 years old, right? And it wasn't until the second year, and I was 16 years old, that I was facing the end of my training period. In other words, I was suddenly going to be chuntered out of my warm, cozy student situation, and I also knew that I had to start thinking about trying to make some money.
Sure, earn a living.
Earn a living and help to support the family.
Yeah.
So shall I just keep going?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, because my last year in drama school, I was lucky enough to be in a class with a young man who was a professional dancer. His name was Arthur Bourbon, and he danced with a partner, and they would do ballroom dancing together all around New York. And he wanted to be an actor, so he enrolled in the school. And they were always happy to have guys because they never could get enough boys, you know, so they would often give scholarships to boys, not to girls, because they all had to pay. Except for me, I was very lucky. But anyway, he decided that I was really, he thought I had some sort of talent, you know. Nobody else did at that point. Well, that's not quite true. I shouldn't say that, because a lot of agents came to see us. Maynard Morris, who was with the MCA crowd, came to see me. Audrey Wood, who was an extremely distinguished agent, came to see the plays that we did in our last year. And it was during that period that I was asked to come and see those agents in their offices, because that's the way it worked in those days. You got a call to come to see an agent, and if an agent was casting a play, she would promote you if she thought you were right for a part, and that's how you got to meet a producer or the director. So I obviously was showing some talent. I was playing Lady Windermere. I was in also a play called House Party. I played a drunk in that, I think, and several plays.
Excuse me, were you doing this before audiences?
Small audiences, of a very small little kind of theater. It was really more like a platform with a curtain that came across, and a very shallow stage area, which was the theater for the Fagan School. And we did small productions there. But we finally, in our last months of school, we went to the Heckscher Theater, which you probably know, which is up 90th Street and Central Park, and Fifth Avenue, actually, way up. But anyway, this fellow, Arthur Bourbon, decided that he could teach me an act. I needed to make money. He could send me out. And he knew agents, and he'd get me a job. So by golly, he and I worked out this act, which he thought I could do. And it was all built around a song of Noel Coward's called I Went to a Marvelous Party. And within the framework of that song, he allowed me to show all of these various facets of humor, of funny voices, languages, all of the things I just did for fun, you know. I do them in the anteroom. I never did them on stage. I did them in the anteroom, you know, the way people do when you're fooling around. And I used to do the Wagnerian singer. I did a Wagnerian singer. I did a French chanteuse. I did sort of English music hall types, all within the framework of this one song. So my act was, I opened with All the Things You Are, and then I went into this song, and then I finished with Tangerine or something, and that was my act. Well, I got to audition at Roseland, in that big building there right off Broadway, for the agents. And this one agent said, I have a fellow who's coming down from Montreal. He has a nightclub up there, and he's looking for an act. Will you come back and do it for him? Well, yes, I did. I did it for him, and I got the job. And I was 16. I said I was 19. And it was going to take place in, I think it was in June. I would go up to Montreal and for 3 weeks, and I was going to be paid $60 a week, which was a fortune.
Sure.
I got to tell you, $60 to me was just absolutely a fortune. I bought the first dress out of that money. I'll never forget it. Anyway, I went up there and...
Excuse me, that was your first professional engagement?
Yes, absolutely. That was it.
And what was the name of the place?
It was called the Samovar.
A nightclub then?
It was a nightclub, yes. It was run by a Russian emigres, a wonderful Russian woman with iron gray hair. It was all piled up on top of her head, and her son was the manager, and I almost had his name on the tip of my tongue. Well, let me tell you, my bacon was saved by the Royal Canadian RAF and the RAF, because they all came to this nightclub, and they took care of me. They absolutely looked after me. They knew damn well I was just a kid, you know. And
you weren't chaperoned?
I wasn't chaperoned. I slept in a double bed to save money with a Yugoslavian singer. She was a female. And we shared, you know, and there was a Spanish dancer, and there was a sword swallower. And we were we were the program. And we did all right. And they had this kind of wonderful kind of Russian band. What do they call them? Forget what they call those musicians. They're kind of Slavic, interesting, all kinds of different mandolins and instruments. And they played my music. And when I turned up on the first day to go run through my act, they said, well, where's your orchestrations, you know? I had the sense to say, what are you talking about orchestra? I don't have orchestrations. I just have a piano, you know. I don't want to have an orchestra drowning me out, you know. Something said to me I must cover for the fact that I didn't have orchestrations. I would have orchestrations. I didn't have 2 cents. So anyway, I did it with a piano. And the orchestra, finally, I got to know them all. And then they all joined in, and then they accompanied me. They just, you know, they kind of did their own accompaniment to the piano.
How did you feel performing before an audience? Were you ever nervous starting out?
God, absolutely pie-eyed with nerves. I mean, talk about dry mouth. I mean, I had all of those things, but I really had the confidence of the old man. I don't know how I did it, and to this day, I don't know how I have done some of the things I've done. Chutzpah. That's what I've got.
What about necessity?
Not even necessity, really, because it all just came bubbling along, and I just did it. It was there, and I did it, you know. It was offered to me, and I did it. So if somebody says, can you do such and so, if there's a chance that you can do it, you'll say yes, right? So then you have to go ahead and do it. You can't suddenly say, I don't think I can do that after. No, forget it. Never should have said I'd do it, you know. But that never occurred to me, I must say, because I always felt that I was at the beginning of a long journey, you know, and I was going to do it. I didn't think I was very good, but at least I knew the material that I was doing was okay. I know I didn't do it well, but I got out there and just sort of did it with this curious kind of chutzpah.
How long did that first engagement
3 weeks.
last?
3 weeks.
And then what happened?
I went back to New York, went back out to Long Island, had a holiday with my brothers who were out there. My mother was on tour, you understand. She was way out in Western Canada by that time. Certainly she'd gotten as far as Alberta or someplace like that, right in the middle, I guess. But anyway, she ended up in Vancouver. And instead of getting on the train and coming back to New York, which they gave her a ticket to do, she wrote to me and said, look, instead of going back to New York, I'm going to go down to take the money and buy a ticket and go to Los Angeles, because I think I've got some family down there. We have some family. And so she did. She came down to Los Angeles. I, meantime, just stayed back east. We had a tiny apartment by that time in Morton Street in the village. The boys were with me. And so when I had a wire from her saying, pack up the boys, send them back to school. They had scholarships. They went to the Choate School. They were very fortunate. They're very lucky indeed.
Yes.
And I sent them back to school. She said, close up the apartment, get rid of everything. I don't know how I did it to this day. I really don't know how I did it because I was only 16. And anyway, I did. And I got on the train and I traveled out to Los Angeles.
By train?
On the Challenger, it was called. Yes.
Took you several days, did it? Or
it took, I think it was overnight to Chicago where you sit up. And then from Chicago to Los Angeles, you got to have a bunk and go to sleep. Yeah.
And your mother met you when you...
My mother met me at Union Station in Los Angeles. I never forget arriving in Los Angeles.
What did Los Angeles look like?
Oh, it was so hot. It was incredible, very dry, and I always remember the geraniums on the platform even in Union Station in those days, and being met by my mother and by our distant relatives, the Hughes family, and they owned a small apartment house down in the Rampart area, down off Wilshire down there, and they let us one of their one-room apartments for a very small amount of money, $28 a month, I think, and my mother and I moved in there. The boys, you understand, were still at school back east, so she and I moved into this very small apartment, and I slept in the kitchen. We had a pull-down bed in the kitchen, because it was a kind of dinette area, and there was room for a bed. And we lived, and she slept in the main room, which was also one of those pull-down beds. You know.
Going through some of these hardships, living not high on the hog, must have had an impact on you. At the very least, it had to make you humble.
It does, you know. It doesn't rub off easy, that kind of way of having to conduct life, but it makes you want to get out of it as quickly as possible. But it gives you a thorough grounding in values, and I'm very grateful that I had that, because I certainly never had that experience in England or in London as growing up. So as a part of my development, I think it was very helpful.
Were your sights or your mother's sights set on the motion picture business like everybody else in Los Angeles?
Oh, absolutely, because that was the whole buzz of the town was movies.
Right.
And of course, we really didn't know anybody, but it turned out that she did. She knew quite a few of the English contingent here.
I must ask you to pause here, if I may.